Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I rise to call attention today, sadly, to the triumph of pork barrel parochialism in this year's omnibus appropriations bill. In particular, a policy provision that was airdropped into this bill in direct contravention to the National Defense Authorization Act, which will have U.S. taxpayers subsidize Russian aggression and comrade capitalism. Nearly 2 years ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, furious that the Ukrainian people had ousted a pro-Moscow stooge, invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. It's the first time since the days of Hitler and Stalin that brute force had been projected across an internationally recognized border to dismember a sovereign state on the European continent. More than 8,000 people have died in this conflict, including 298 innocent people aboard Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 who were murdered by Vladimir Putin's loyal supporters with weapons that Vladimir Putin had supplied them with. Putin's imperialist campaign in Eastern Europe forced a recognition for anyone who was not yet convinced that we're confronting a challenge that many had assumed was resigned to the history books. A strong, militarily capable Russian government that is hostile to our interests and our values and seeks to challenge the international order that American leaders of both parties have sought to maintain since the end of World War II. And that's why the Congress imposed tough sanctions against Russia, especially against Putin's cronies and their enormous and enormously corrupt business empires. Part of that effort, Congress passed the fiscal year 2015 National Defense Authorization Act, which restricted the Air Force from using Russian-made RD-180 rocket engines for national security space launches, engines that are manufactured by a Russian company controlled by some of Putin's top cronies. We did so not only because our nation should not rely on Russia to access space, but because it's simply immoral to help subsidize Russia's intervention in Ukraine and line the pockets of Putin's gang of thugs who profit from the sale of Russian rocket engines. Last year, the Defense Authorization Bill exempted the 5 of the engines that United Launch Alliance purchased before the invasion of Ukraine. This allowed ULA, the space launch company that for years has enjoyed a monopoly on launching military satellites, to use those Russian rocket engines if the Secretary of Defense determined it was necessitated by national security. Since the passage of the act in the Senate, 89-11, Russia has continued, as we all know, to destabilize Ukraine, menace our NATO allies in Europe with aggressive military behavior. Putin has sent advanced weapons to Iran, violated the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, and now in a profound echo of the Cold War, Russia has intervened militarily in Syria on behalf of the murderous regime of Bashar Assad. Clearly, Russian behavior has only gotten worse. That's why, a few weeks ago, Congress acted again and passed the fiscal year 2016 National Defense Authorization Act. The NDAA authorized $300 million in security assistance and intelligence support for Ukraine to resist Russian aggression. At the same time, the bill recognized that a small number of Russian engines could be needed to maintain competition in the national security space launch program and facilitate a smooth transition to rockets with U.S.-made engines. Therefore, the legislation allowed ULA to use a total of 9 Russian engines. The fiscal year 16 Defense Authorization Bill, including its provision limiting the use of Russian rocket engines, were debated for months. For months, the issue was debated. The Committee on Armed Services had a vigorous debate over this important issue. An amendment was offered to maintain the restriction on the Air Force's use of Russian rocket engines, and in a positive vote of the committee, the amendment was adopted. We then considered hundreds of amendments to this bill on the Senate floor over a period of 2 weeks. For 2 weeks, We literally considered hundreds of amendments. And we did so transparently, with an open process, which was a credit, frankly, to both sides. There was not one amendment that was called up to change the provision of that authorization bill concerning the RD-180 rocket engines. The legislation passed with 71 votes. Then, because of a misguided presidential veto, this defense legislation was actually considered a second time on the floor, and it passed 91-3. I want to emphasize again, one of the things that I was proud of for years is that we do debate the Senate Armed Services, the National Defense Authorization Bill. We have every year for some 43 years, and passed it and had the president sign it. And we open it to all amendments. But there was no amendment on rocket engines proposed on the floor of the Senate. Why wasn't it? If there were members of the Senate who did not like the provisions in the bill, we had an open process to amend it. But they didn't. They didn't because they knew they could not pass an amendment that would remove that provision in the Defense Authorization Act. So now in the dead of night, we just find out hours before we're supposed to vote, they put in a restriction which dramatically changes that provision that was done in an open and transparent process, to their everlasting shame. In the dark of night, not a vote, not a vote. No one consulted on the defense and the Armed Services Committee. This bill, including its provisions limiting the use, the fiscal year 16 bill, including its provision limiting the use of Russian rocket engine, was debated for months. The committee had a vigorous debate, as I mentioned, and here's my point. The Senate had this debate. We had ample time and opportunity to have this debate. And through months of this fulsome debate, no senator came to the Senate floor to make the case that we needed to buy more Russian rocket engines. No senator introduced an amendment on the floor to lift the restriction on buying more Russian rocket engines. To the contrary, the Senate and the full Congress, including the House of Representatives, voted overwhelmingly and repeatedly to maintain this restriction. This is a policy issue, not a money issue. Nowhere in the realm of the Appropriations Committee. And it was resolved as it should have been on the Defense Policy Bill. And here we stand. Here we stand with a 2,000-page omnibus appropriations bill crafted in secret crafted. Members outside of the Appropriations Committee were not brought into the formulation of this legislation. No debate. Most of us are seeing for the first time this bill this morning, and buried within it is a policy provision that would effectively allow unlimited purchase and use of, guess what, Russian rocket engines. What's going on here? What's going on? ULA wants more Russian engines, plain and simple. That's why ULA recently asked the Defense Department to waive the previous restrictions on the basis of national security and let it use a Russian engine for the first competitive national security space launch. The Defense Department declined. So what did ULA do when it couldn't get its way? It manufactured a crisis. Though the Department of Defense is restricted in using these Russian rocket engines, there is no similar restriction on NASA or commercial space launches, so ULA rushed to assign the RD-180s, that's the rocket engines, that it had in its inventory to these non-national security launches, despite the fact there's no restriction on the use of Russian engines for those launches. This artificial crisis has now been seized on by ULA's Capitol Hill leading sponsors, namely the senator from Alabama, Senator Shelby, and the senior senator from Illinois, Senator Durbin, to overturn the NDAA's restriction. And that's exactly what they've done, again, secretly, non-transparently, as part of this massive 2,000-page omnibus appropriations bill. As I said, neither Senator Shelby nor Senator Durbin, nor any other senator raised objections to the provisions of the bill that we are offered any alternative during the authorization process on the Senate floor. That is a repudiation of the rights of every single senator in this body that is not a member of the Appropriations Committee. In fact, as I've said, when this issue was debated and voted on in the Committee of Armed Services, the authorizing Committee of Jurisdiction voted in favor of maintaining the restriction. Instead, my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee crafted this provision in secret with no debate to overturn the will of the Senate as expressed in 2 National Defense Authorization Acts, and the result will enable a monopolistic corporation to send potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to Vladimir Putin and his corrupt cronies and deepen America's reliance on these thugs for our military access to space. This is outrageous and it's shameful, and it is the height of hypocrisy, especially for my colleagues who claim to care about the plight of Ukraine and the need to punish Russia for its aggression. How can our government tell European countries and governments that they need to hold the line on maintaining sanctions on Russia, which is far harder for them to do than us, when we are getting our own policy in this way? We are gutting our own policy. How can we tell our French allies in particular they shouldn't sell Vladimir Putin amphibious assault ships, as we have, and then turn around and try to buy rocket engines from Putin's cronies? Again, this is the height of hypocrisy. Since March 2014, my colleagues and I in the Senate have tried to do everything we can to give our friends in Ukraine the tools they need to defend themselves and their country from Russian aggression. Rather than furthering that noble cause, Senator Shelby and Senator Durbin have chosen to reward Vladimir Putin and his cronies with a windfall of hundreds of millions of dollars. A rocket factory in Alabama may benefit from this provision. Boeing, headquartered in Illinois, may benefit from this decision. But have no doubt, the real winners today are Vladimir Putin and his gang of thugs running the Russian military-industrial complex. I wish that Senator Shelby and Senator Durbin would explain to the American taxpayer exactly who we are doing business with. They won't, but my colleagues need to know. So let me explain. At least one news organization has investigated how much the Air Force pays for these RD-180 rocket engines, how much the Russians receive, and whether members of the elite in Putin's Russia have secretly profited by inflating the price. In an investigative series entitled, quote, Comrade Capitalism, Reuters exposed the role that senior Russian politicians and Putin's close friends, including persons sanctioned over Ukraine, have played in a company called NPO Energo-Mash, which manufactures the RD-180. According to Reuters, a Russian audit of that company found that it had been operating at a loss because funds were, quote, being captured by unnamed offshore intermediary companies, unquote. In addition, the Reuters investigation also reported that NPO Energo-Mash sells its rocket engines to ULA through another company called RD Amros, a tiny 5-person outfit that stood to collect about $93 million in cost markups under a multi-year deal to supply these engines. The Defense Contract Management Agency found that in one contract alone, RD Amros did, quote, no or negligible work, but still collected $80 million in unallowable excessive pass-through charges. Now remember, my friends, that is a 5-person outfit, 5 persons. And the Defense Contract Management Agency found that in one contract, but collected $80 million in unallowable excessive pass-through charges. My friends, that's who, thanks to this amendment, is going to continue to receive this money. According to University of Baltimore School of Law professor Charles Tiefer, who reviewed Reuters documents, and I quote, "The bottom line is that the joint venture between the Russians and Americans is taking us to the cleaners," unquote. He said that he had reviewed Pentagon audits critical of Iraq war contracts, but those, quote, "didn't come anywhere near to how strongly negative the R.D. Amros audit was." My colleagues, we got to do better. We got to do better than this. Now, some may say we need to buy rocket engines from Putin's cronies in Russia. In particular, they will cite a letter from the Department of Defense in response to a list of leading questions from the Appropriations Committee just a few days ago, which they will claim as confirmation that the department believes that the United States will not have a domestically manufactured replacement engine for defense space launches before 2022. And of course, that's nonsense. When the Department of Defense starts making predictions beyond its 5-year budget plan, what I hear is, quote, "this isn't a priority," or "we don't really know." Either way, this is unacceptable. Both the authorizers and the appropriators have ramped up funding for the development of a new domestically manufactured engine. The Pentagon needs to do what it has failed to do for 8 years, make this a priority. Indeed, American companies have already said that they could have a replacement engine ready before 2022. Our money and attention should be focused on meeting this goal, not subsidizing Putin's defense industry. Proponents of more Russian rocket engines will also cite claims by the Air Force that ULA needs at least 18 RD-180 engines to create a, quote, "bridge between now and 2022, when a domestically manufactured engine becomes available." This, too, is false. Today, we have two space launch providers, ULA and SpaceX, that, no matter what happens with the Russian RD-180, will be able to provide fully redundant capabilities with ULA's Delta IV and SpaceX's Falcon 9, and eventually the Falcon Heavy space launch vehicles. There will be no capability gap. The Atlas V is not going anywhere anytime soon. ULA has enough Atlas Vs to get them through at least 2019, if not later. And as I alluded a moment ago, the Pentagon agrees that no action is required today to address a risk or assured access to space. In declining ULA's recent request for a waiver from the Defense Authorization Bill's restriction, the Deputy Secretary of Defense concluded, quote, that they, quote, "do not believe any immediate action is required to address the further risk of having only one source of space launch services." Indeed, in its recent letter, the Department of Defense even confirmed that ULA has enough engines to compete for each of the 9 upcoming competitions, and that the number they will pursue is, quote, "dependent upon ULA's business management strategy." So I ask Senator Shelby and Senator Durbin, what are your priorities? As we speak, Ukrainians are resisting Russian aggression and fighting to keep their country whole and free. Yet this omnibus appropriations bill will send hundreds of millions of dollars to Vladimir Putin, his cronies, and Russia's military-industrial base as Russia continues to occupy Crimea, destabilize Ukraine and their neighbors in the region. What kind of message does that send to Ukrainians who have been fighting and dying to protect their country? How can we do this when Putin is menacing our NATO allies in Europe? How can we do this when Russia continues to send weapons to Iran? How can we do this when Putin continues to violate the 1987 Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty? How can we do this when Putin is bombing U.S.-backed forces in Syria fighting the murderous Assad regime? I understand that some constituents of Senator Shelby and Senator Durbin believe they would benefit from this provision. But as the New York Times editorial board stated earlier this year, when sanctions are necessary, the countries that impose them must be willing to pay a cost too. After leaning on France to cancel the sale of 2 ships to Russia because of the invasion of Ukraine, the United States can hardly insist on continuing to buy national security hardware from one of Mr. Putin's cronies. I repeat, that is in the New York Times. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent. The article, the editorial entitled "Don't Back Down on Russian Sanctions" by the New York Times be included in the record.
Without objection.
On the record, I make this promise. If this language undermining the National Defense Authorization Act is not removed from the omnibus, I assure my colleagues that this issue will not go unaddressed in the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. Up to this point, we have sought to manage this issue on an annual basis, and we've always maintained that if a genuine crisis emerged, we would not compromise our national security interest in space. We've sought to be flexible and open to new information. But if this is how our efforts are repaid, then perhaps we need to look at a complete and indefinite restriction on Putin's rocket engine. I take no pleasure in saying that. I believe that avoiding the year-over-year conflict over this matter between our Authorizing and Appropriations Committee is in our nation's best interest. Such back and forth only delays our shared desire to end our reliance on Russian technology and from our space launch supply chain while injecting instability into our national security space launch program. That instability threatens the reliable launch of our most sensitive national security satellites and the stability of the fragile industrial base that support them. But I cannot allow the Appropriations Committee or any other member of this body to craft a take-it-or-leave-it omnibus spending bill that allows a monopolistic corporation to do business with Russian oligarchs to buy overpriced rocket engines that fund Russia's belligerent in Crimea and Ukraine and its support for Assad in Syria and its neo-imperial ambitions. Now, I'd like to address this issue in a larger context. The way that the Congress is supposed to work is that authorizing committees authorize, whether it be in domestic or international or, in this case, defense programs. The responsibility of the authorizing committee is to make sure, in the case of defense, the Armed Services Committee, the training, equipping, the authorizing the funding, the policies, all of that fall under the Armed Services Committee. The Appropriations Committee is required in their responsibilities to decide the funding for these programs. It is within their authority to zero out a program if they don't think that the funding is called for or necessary. They can add funding if they want to for various programs. But this is a complete violation, a complete and total violation. This issue was raised in the subcommittee and addressed in subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee. It was in the full committee. It was addressed on the floor where there was hundreds of amendments that were proposed. And yet, what was decided by the Armed Services Committee remained intact until, in the dark of the night, until 10 or 11 or 12, whatever time it was this morning, up pops a direct contradiction, a direct dismembering, a direct cancellation of a provision in the law where we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars that have no bearing whatsoever on the authority and responsibility of the Appropriations Committee. So there's two problems here. One, it was done in the dark of night, in the middle of the night, but no one knew. And second of all, it is in direct violation of the relationship between the authorizing committees and the Appropriations Committee. So I say to my colleagues that are not on the Appropriations Committee, if you let this go, then maybe you're next. Maybe it's an amendment or a program that you have supported, that you, through debate and discussion and authorizing the committee and votes and amendments on the floor of the Senate, and then in the middle of the night, when in December, when we're going out of session in 48 hours or so, or 72 hours, that then up pops a provision that negates the entire work of the authorizing committee over days and weeks and months? I say to my colleagues, you could be next. You could be next. And that's why this in itself, subsidizing Vladimir Putin, is outrageous enough. But if we're going to allow this kind of middle-of-the-night airdropping, fundamental changes in programs and proposals and policies that have been debated in the open, that have been voted on in the open, completely negate it, then we are destroying the very fundamental structure of how the United States Senate and the United States Congress is supposed to work. So, Madam President, I yield the floor.